everybody. Today we are going to learn about Chapter 5, Inheritance. Before we start, let me ask you, what is inheritance? Inheritance is basically how we inherit the characteristics or the genes from our parents. And before we start, let's go through a few terminologies first. Now, the first one will be gene. What is gene? Gene is the basic unit of inheritance, and it is the gene that determines the characteristic in organisms, like for example the height, the color of the skin, the color of the flower. And then what is allele? Now this is pronounced as allele, not allele. It's allele. Allele is actually the alternative forms of the same genes that occupies the same locus of the homologous chromosome. So imagine that we have a pair of homologous chromosome. How do I know that this is a pair of homologous chromosome? I judge from the appearance of this chromosome. They have the same length and they carry the same genes at the same locus. So for example, if these genes determine the color of the hair, this one also determines the color of the hair. Alright, so that's why I say that these chromosomes are homologous chromosome. And then what is allele? Allele is the alternative form of that gene. Allele is the alternative form of the same genes. Let's say if this gene determines that the color of the hair is black, the alternative gene, which is allele, could determine the other color of that hair. Let's say it's bronze or it's bronze. Okay. Now, so we can come to this conclusion here. The gene determines the characteristic in that organism. Well, the allele, which is the alternative form of that gene, determines the trait of that specific characteristic. So example of characteristic would be, let's say, the color of the hair, and then the traits of that characteristic would be black hair or bronze. Okay, hopefully that you can differentiate genes from alleles, characteristic from traits. Now the third terminology that we are going to learn is genotype. It is actually the genes, okay, the genes of that organisms that cannot be seen, and it refers to the pair of gene on the homologous chromosome. Phenotype, on the other hand, is the observable characteristic of that organism, and phenotype is actually determined by the genotype of that organism. And please note that the blood type A, B, or O, even though they are non-observable characteristic, but they are actually phenotype, because our blood type is actually determined by the genotype. Now, still remember what is allele? Allele is the alternative form of that genes, and we have genes, okay, that are able to produce the phenotype of that organism. We also have alleles that will only produce the phenotype of that organism if there is no dominant allele in that pair of homologous chromosome. So normally the dominant allele will be represented by capital letter. So let's say the allele that determines the hair color, black hair color, will be represented by capital B. And then the recessive allele, let's say it determines that the color of the hair is bronze, so it would be represented by small letter b. So each characteristic is actually controlled by a pair of allele. So if we have this combination, then certainly our phenotype would be black hair. And if we have a combination of them, big B and small b, we will still get the black hair, simply because the big B, the capital B, is dominant over the small letter b. If we have this combination in our genotype, small b and small b, then we will have the bronze hair, let's see. So from here we know that the allele capital B is dominant over allele small letter b. So the A recessive allele can only produce its phenotype if there is no dominant allele. Now, next one. So what is the term coined for this type of genotype? We call them homozygous dominant. So if I say that an organism is homozygous dominant, then we know both the alleles must be dominant. If I say that an organism is homozygous recessive, then we know for sure that the genotype must consist of 2 recessive alleles. If it is heterozygous, okay, we don't have this term known as heterozygous dominant. We just say heterozygous. If an organism is heterozygous, then we know that the genotype must be this. If you cross a plant which is tall to a plant which is short, what will happen to their first filial generation of their offspring? Would they be all tall or be all short, or it is actually a mixture of tall and short plant, or the offspring have actually intermediate height? So this also intrigued Mendel. Who is Mendel? Who is Gregor Mendel? Gregor Mendel was also known as the father of modern genetics. It is because he was the first man to discover the law of inheritance. Alright, so let's look at what he did many years ago. So in the first place, he tried to get a tall plant first, and he makes sure that the parents, the grandparents, and the grandparents of this plant is all tall. So I call this plant as a pure breeding tall plant. Now on the other hand, he must also try to get another plant which is short, and he makes sure that the parents, the grandparents, and the grandparents of this tree is short. So this plant is also known as a pure breeding short plant. He tried to get the pollen grain from the male plant. Now this symbol represents the male plant, and he brushes the pollen grain onto the stigma of the female plants. So guess what happens? Of course, he gets a lot of seeds, and he planted all of them. And to his utter surprise, the offspring, the first filial generation of the F1 generation, were all tall. Oops! What happens to the short plant? What happens to the short characteristic? Are they eaten up by the pests? Why don't they survive? What happens to them? So this question intrigued him again. So to solve his problem, then he tried to cross the first filial generation with another first filial generation. That means to say that he tried to cross a tall plant, a tall F1 generation, to another tall F1 generation. And guess what is the outcome of the second filial generation, or the F2 generation? He discovered that almost 75% of the F2 generation are tall. 75% of them are tall, and then only 25% are short. So what can explain about this phenomenon? There are 2 observations here. The first observation is why F1 are all tall, and then the second observation is why when we cross the F1 generation with another F1 generation, which is also tall, and we get 75% tall and 25% short. So luckily he was also a very good mathematician. He tried to work it out mathematically. Then that's why he come to this conclusion. So what was his conclusion? This conclusion is now what we call as the Mendel's first law. And he proposed that for each characteristic of an organism, it is determined by a pair of alleles. That time we call this alleles as factor, because we still do not call this factor as alleles. and only one allele of that pair can be present in the gamete. Okay, so let's see. Now, so to show the inheritance, this inheritance, we need to apply what we learned, the terminologies that we learned just now. So this is a pure breeding tall plant, and and okay, let's say I give capital T, capital T as the dominant allele. Since it is tall, so both since it is a pure breeding plant, so both of the allele must be capital T. And what about the female plant? Since it is a pure breeding short plant, so it must have both recessive alleles. And according to Mendel, during the formation of gamete, the gamete can only get either one of the pair of alleles. So same as this. So what is the process of the formation of gamete? It is known as meiosis. And during random fertilization, the capital T, this allele, fertilizes with the small t, giving you the F1 generation with this phenotype, okay, which is capital T and small letter t. And since capital T is dominant over the small letter t, so that's why the short phenotype is not expressed, is not shown in the first filial generation. They were all tall. Then, when Mendel crossed the tall plant, the F1 generation with another F1 generation which is also tall, okay, guess what happens to their gamete? So this F1 generation is able to produce two types of gamete. One is capital T, one is small letter t. Same as this, big T and small t. So how to get the second filial generation? Of course, fertilization will have to take place. So these two will give you capital T and capital T. The fusion between capital T and small letter t will give you this combination. Now this might also combine with this to give you this genotype. And let's just complete the random fertilization. So in random fertilization, this gamete can pair with this gamete. It can also pair with this gamete, so giving rise to these two types of genotype. On the other hand, this gamete can also pair with this gamete or this gamete, giving rise to these two genotype. So if you look at their genotypic ratio, you will discover that out of 4 types of possibility, you get 1 big T, 2 portions of big T, small t, and 1 portion of small t. And what would be their phenotype? Big T and big T will certainly give you a tall plant. And then big T and small t, the heterozygous is also tall. And then now this is a recessive, a homozygous recessive plant, so that's why it is short. So if you compute their phenotypic ratio, then you will discover that there are 3 out of 4 possibilities are tall. 3 out of 4 are tall. Only 1 out of 4 is short. Okay, so the Mendel have solved the problem for us. So what is the phenotypic ratio in monohybrid inheritance? Is 3:1. What is monohybrid inheritance? Monohybrid inheritance is the inheritance involving only one type of characteristic, and in this case, it is the height of the plant.